The grand chamber of the High Synod of Xylos did not smell of fear. It smelled of ozone, polished obsidian, and the ancient, recirculated air of a civilization that had forgotten what it meant to struggle for survival. High Counselor Valdor stared out of the monolithic glass-steel viewing port, his faceted eyes reflecting the nebular clouds swirling around the station, though his mind was light years away, entrenched in the ashes of the burning outer colonies. The chamber was silent, save for the rhythmic, low-frequency thrum of the station's gravitational stabilizers, a sound that usually brought comfort but now felt like the heartbeat of a dying god. Around the circular table of black marble, the representatives of the Galactic Concordat sat in various states of distress, their bioluminescence dimming in accordance with their anxiety, their mandibles clicking in hushed, terrified debates that had long since lost their diplomatic veneer. They were the masters of the known galaxy, the architects of the hyperlanes, the tamers of stars, and yet, facing the encroaching darkness of the fractal enemy known only as the Scourge, they were nothing more than children hiding from a storm they could not comprehend. Valdor turned from the window, his heavy ceremonial robes dragging across the floor with a sound like dry leaves, and looked at War Master Krell of the Vracular Imperium, whose armored carapace was scarred from 100 battles that now seemed insignificant compared to the annihilation facing them. Krell was a warrior of the old code, a creature of honor and violence, yet even he sat with his head bowed, his 4 clawed hands resting motionless on the table, the holographic tactical map in the center of the room displaying a sea of red indicators swallowing their borders. The silence was broken not by a word, but by the activation of the central hololith, projecting the image of a burning world, the surface cracked and bleeding magma as the Scourge fleets, geometric nightmares of impossible angles and dark matter, harvested the planetary core. Valdor felt the collective psychic shudder of the Zolofian delegates, their empathy linking them to the dying billions, while the Vracular growled low in their throats, a sound of impotent rage. It was the 7th world lost in 3 standard rotations. The Concordat's fleets, comprised of elegant, energy-shielded frigates and kinetic-lance destroyers, had shattered against the Scourge's hulls like glass against stone. Their technology, refined over 10,000 years of peace and artistic expression, was useless against a force that seemed to weaponize physics itself. There was no strategy left, no reserve fleets to call upon, only the waiting, the inevitable calculation of how long it would take for the Scourge to reach the core worlds and extinguish the light of the Synod forever. It was in this atmosphere of terminal despair that the topic of the humans was raised again, a topic that had been dismissed with derision only cycles ago, but now hung in the air like a desperate prayer spoken by an atheist. It was Sub-Minister Alara, a young and somewhat radical diplomat from the aquatic worlds of Nim, who broke the heavy silence, her voice trembling as it was translated by the collar around her neck into the trade tongue. She suggested, with a hesitation that spoke of the ridicule she expected, that they activate the dormant beacon, the archaic signaling device given to them by the Terran Republic during the brief, awkward contact incident 50 cycles prior. Valdor suppressed a sigh of frustration, his patience worn thin by the circular arguments of the past week, and looked at Alara with a mixture of pity and annoyance. The humans were a footnote in the galactic history books, a species of short-lived, chemically volatile bipeds who inhabited a resource-poor sector of the galactic arm, isolated by dangerous radiation storms and gravity wells that made travel to their territory economically unviable. They were considered primitives by Concordat standards, a race that still relied on combustion, solid-state projectiles, and nuclear fission long after the rest of the galaxy had moved on to zero-point energy and coherent light weaponry. They were loud, chaotic, and aggressively independent, refusing the Concordat's offer of client status and choosing instead to retreat back into their dark corner of the void. To call upon them now, Valdor reasoned, was not only an exercise in futility, but an insult to the dignity of the Synod. What could a race that still burned dead plants for fuel possibly offer against an enemy that ate stars? Krell, however, did not scoff. The War Master raised his heavy head, his slit-pupiled eyes narrowing as he recalled the reports from the border patrols that had monitored the human exclusion zone. He spoke in a voice like grinding stones, reminding the Council that while the humans were crude, they were survivors of a Death World-class ecosystem, a SB. SEs that had nearly destroyed itself a dozen times and yet persisted. He argued that while their technology was archaic, it was built with a redundancy and brutality that the elegant ships of the Concordat lacked, and in a war where sophistication had failed, perhaps brutality was the only currency left with any value. The debate raged for hours, a desperate oscillation between arrogance and hopelessness, until the censors of the station screamed a warning that cut through the rhetoric like a blade. The scourge had bypassed the outer blockade. They were not weeks away. They were here. The reality of the situation crashed down upon the council with the weight of a collapsing star. The tactical hololith shifted, zooming out to show the local system, where the fabric of space was tearing open, bleeding the sickly violet light of the scourge slipspace drive. Panic, raw and undiluted, erupted in the chamber. Delegates scrambled for their communication devices, shouting orders to fleets that were already burning, while Valdor stood frozen, watching the end of his civilization unfold in high definition. The scourge vessels emerged, vast octahedrons of black metal that absorbed the light of the local sun, their weapon ports glowing with the anticipation of slaughter. The Concordat's home defense fleet, the pride of the Synod, moved to intercept, a glittering wall of white and gold ships that looked beautiful and fragile against the backdrop of the void. The first volley was exchanged, and the result was catastrophic. The Concordat's energy shields flickered and died under the onslaught of the Scourge's entropy beams, which simply unmade the molecular bonds of the hulls, turning majestic dreadnoughts into clouds of drifting dust. It was a massacre, a slaughter so absolute that it defied the comprehension of the tactical computers, which struggled to calculate casualty rates that were effectively 100%. Valdor closed his eyes, accepting the inevitability of death, when the sensor officer, a tremor in his voice, announced a new energy signature entering the system, not from the Scourge vectors and not from any known Concordat hyperlane. The arrival was not graceful. There was no shimmering portal of light, no elegant folding of space. Instead, the void between the Scourge fleet and the defenseless station seemed to rupture violently, space-time buckling under an immense, brute-force trauma. Gravitational alarms wailed across the station as the localized mass index spiked to impossible levels, suggesting the sudden appearance of a moon-sized object. From the tier in reality, a shape emerged, wreathed in the lightning of a shattered dimension, pushing its way into real space with a mechanical scream that resonated through the hulls of every ship in the system. It was ugly. That was Valdor's first thought. It was profoundly, aggressively ugly. It was a block of dark gray durasteel, a rectangular slab of industrial brutalism that lacked any hint of aerodynamics or aesthetic consideration. It was covered in scars, pockmarked by asteroid impacts and plasma burns, bristling with antennae arrays that looked like a forest of dead trees. It was huge, dwarfing the Scourge capital ships, a flying city of metal and rage. There were no glowing energy shields surrounding it, no elegant curves. On its flank, painted in white letters that were chipped and faded but still legible, was the name, USC Dauntless. Below it, the designation, Heavy Siege Platform, Earth. The council chamber fell into a stunned silence, the delegates staring at the monstrosity that had just crashed their funeral. The Scourge, seemingly confused by this new variable, paused their advance, their sensors scanning the primitive behemoth that radiated heat and radiation like a leaking reactor. Then came the transmission. It did not bypass the security protocols with elegant code. It simply overpowered the communication array with a signal strength so high it nearly blew out the station's speakers. There was no video feed, no diplomatic avatar, just audio. A voice, human male, sounding incredibly tired and sounding as if it were speaking through a mouthful of gravel. "This is Admiral Vance of the United Sol Command Dauntless. We received a distress beacon. We are responding. Clear the line of fire. We are deploying the grid." The message cut off with a burst of static, leaving the counselors exchanging bewildered glances. Clear the line of fire. There was no line of fire. The Concordat fleet was dust. The Scourge ships, recovering from their momentary pause, reoriented their weapons toward the human vessel. The Vrakyr War Master, Krell, leaned forward, his eyes wide, whispering that the human ship had no shields, its hull was naked to the vacuum. The Scourge fired. Beams of entropy, capable of unmaking matter, lashed out across the void, striking the dauntless dead center. Valdor flinched, expecting the primitive ship to vanish. The beams con. Seated splashing against the gray armor in a blinding display of violet light. But when the light faded, the ship remained. The armor smoked, glowing a dull cherry red where it had been hit, but it did not buckle. It did not dissolve. The humans had not used energy shields. They had used physical armor plating so dense, so layered with ablative ceramics and hyperdense alloys, that it simply absorbed the energy, distributing the heat across the entire hull mass. "Report," Valdor screamed, his composure shattering. How is it still intact? The sensor officer, his hands flying across his console, shouted back in disbelief that the human ship was generating a gravity well equivalent to a small planetary body. The armor wasn't just metal, it was compressed matter held together by magnetic fields strong enough to crush a lesser ship. The Dauntless was not avoiding the damage, it was eating it. And then the human ship returned fire. It did not fire lasers. It did not fire plasma. Along the length of its rectangular hull, massive ports opened, venting atmosphere and debris. From these ports, propelled by magnetic rails that ran the length of the multi-kilometer ship, emerged projectiles the size of skyscrapers. They were solid tungsten slugs, accelerated to a significant fraction of the speed of light. There was no sound in space, but the visual impact was a concussion to the eyes. The slugs crossed the distance in a microsecond, slamming into the Scourge octahedrons. The kinetic energy transfer was absolute. The Scourge shields, designed to disperse energy weapons, shattered instantly under the sheer physical mass of the attack. The alien ships didn't explode. They shattered, cracking open like eggs hit with a sledgehammer. It was a display of violence so primitive, so lacking in finesse, that it was horrifying. The humans were throwing rocks, but they were throwing them with the force of an angry god. The battle that ensued was not a dance of starships, it was a brawl. The Dauntless did not maneuver. It sat in the void, a brooding mountain of iron, taking hit after hit, its hull glowing, venting steam and coolant into space, while its railguns kept up a rhythmic, pounding cadence. Boom, 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 every shot claimed a Scourge vessel. The Concordat delegates watched, mesmerized and sickened. This was not war as they knew it. This was industrial extermination. The humans fought without grace, without honor, without aesthetic. They fought with math and mass. Inside the Dauntless, though the aliens could not see it, the atmosphere was not one of panic, but of cold, drilled precision. Admiral Vance stood on the bridge, a cavernous room filled with analog switches, physical screens, and the smell of coffee and ozone. He was an old man, his face lined with the stress of a species that had to fight for every inch of its existence. He watched the tactical plot, ignoring the shudder of the deck plates as another entropy beam raked the hull. "Engineering," he said into his headset, his voice calm. "Heat sinks are at 80%. Vent the port arrays. Tactical, switch to flak solution for the fighter swarms. Don't let them get close to the station." He didn't care about the politics of the Synod. He didn't care that these aliens had looked down on humanity for a century. He cared that there were civilians on that station, and humanity had a rule written in the blood of their own wars. You do not leave the innocent to the wolves. As the Scourge realized their primary weapons were ineffective against the sheer density of the human armor, they changed tactics. Their fleet swarmed, thousands of smaller fighter craft pouring out of the carrier ships, buzzing toward the Dauntless like a plague of locusts, aiming for the weapon ports, the sensors, the engines. This was where the Concordat expected the humans to fall. A dreadnought of that size could not track fast movers, but the humans had anticipated this. The hull of the Dauntless erupted. Not with single shots, but with a wall of lead. Thousands of automated point defense turrets, rotary cannons that spun with a blur of motion, unleashed a storm of kinetic rounds. It was a wall of lead doctrine, an ancient human concept. If you put enough metal in the air or the vacuum, the enemy will eventually hit it. The space around the Dauntless became a kill zone, a cloud of shrapnel and high-velocity rounds that shredded the delicate Scourge fighters. It was messy. It was wasteful. It was entirely effective. The Vrakyr War Master, watching the slaughter, let out a low, rumbling laugh, the first sound of joy he had made in months. "They are wonderful," he whispered. "They fight like beasts trapped in a corner. They fight like us." Valdor could only stare. He saw the philosophical horror of it. The humans had not advanced by becoming more ethereal, more energy-based like the rest of the galaxy. They had advanced by becoming harder, heavier, more stubborn. They had looked at T8, a hostile universe, and decided that if they could not be faster than the light, they would be harder than the dark. But the Scourge had one final card to play. The lead mothership, a vessel the size of a small moon, began to charge its primary weapon, a singularity projector. The sensors on the station screamed a warning. This was a planet killer, a weapon that created a localized black hole. No armor could withstand it. It would simply swallow the Dauntless whole. Valdor reached for the communication link. "Human vessel," he shouted, breaking protocol. "Detecting gravitational singularity buildup. You must retreat. You cannot withstand that." The response from Admiral Vance was immediate, and it chilled Valdor to the bone. "We see it, Council. We are not retreating. We are the shield." The Dauntless did not back down. Instead, it engaged its engines, massive fusion torch drives that lit up the nebula like a second sun, and rammed itself into the path of the mothership, placing itself directly between the weapon and the station. The singularity fired. A ball of absolute darkness, a tear in the universe, hurtled toward the human ship. The council watched, hearts stopping, waiting for the end. The darkness hit the Dauntless. For a moment the ship vanished, swallowed by the distortion. But then something impossible happened. The darkness didn't grow, it shrank, it fizzled. The Dauntless re-emerged, its hull glowing white-hot, its structure groaning under immense stress but intact. The humans had deployed something else, not a weapon but a field, a reality anchor. The human understanding of physics had taken a different path than the Concordats. Where the aliens manipulated space, humans reinforced it. They had built a machine that solidified the laws of physics in a localized area, enforcing the constants of the universe with such rigidity that the singularity could not sustain itself. It was the ultimate rejection of the Scourge's entropy. The humans were literally telling the universe no. The backlash of the failed singularity surged back into the Scourge mothership, destabilizing its core. The alien vessel crumpled, imploding in on itself in a silent, horrific display of gravitational collapse. The Scourge fleet, their command structure shattered, their greatest weapon failed, broke. They fled, blinking out of real space in a panic, leaving the burning, scarred ruin of the Dauntless drifting victorious in the silence. The aftermath was a blur of confusion and awe. The Dauntless, crippled and leaking atmosphere, was towed into a stable orbit by the surviving station tugs. Shuttles were dispatched. Valdor, Krell, and a delegation of the High Synod boarded the human vessel, their environmental suits protecting them from the radiation leaking from the ship's scarred hull. The interior of the human ship was a shock. It was cramped, utilitarian, filled with the hiss of steam and the clank of metal. Cables hung from the ceiling, the walls were unadorned steel. Crew members, humans in bulky, grease-stained flight suits, ran past them carrying welding torches and medical stretchers. They looked exhausted, pale, and fragile, yet their eyes burned with a fierce, quiet pride. They did not bow to the counselors. They nodded, a gesture of equals. Valdor felt a profound sense of shame. He had looked down on these people as dirt grubbers, yet here they were, bleeding to save a council that had never offered them a hand. They were led to the bridge, where Admiral Vance sat in his command chair, a medic bandaging a gash on his forehead. He stood as they entered, wincing slightly, but his posture was upright. He did not look like a conqueror. He looked like a man who had just finished a very long shift at a very difficult job. "High Counselor," Vance said, his voice raspy. "War Master, I hope the station is intact." Valdor stepped forward, his mandibles trembling. "Admiral, you saved us, your ship. It defied the laws of physics as we know them." Vance chuckled, a dry sound. "Not defied, Counselor, respected. We learned a long time ago that the universe is a hard place. You can't just dance around the blows, sometimes you have to take them." Krell stepped forward, towering over the human, and performed the Vrakyr salute of highest honor, crossing his forearms over his chest and bowing his head. "You fought with the spirit of the ancients," Krell rumbled. "Your hull is iron, but your spirit is neutronium. The Vrakyr will not forget this." Vance nodded, accepting the compliment. "We didn't do it for glory," Vance said quietly, looking at the tactical screen where the wreckage of the Scourge fleet drifted. "We did it because we know what the Scourge is." This was the turning point, the moment the atmosphere shifted from relief to a new, deeper tension. "What do you mean?" Valdor asked. Vance tapped a command on his console and the main screen changed. It showed a star chart, but not of the galaxy. It showed T. He void beyond the galactic rim. "We didn't build the Dauntless to fight you or to fight pirates," Vance explained, his voice dropping to a whisper. "We built it because we found something on the edge of our space. The Scourge. They aren't invaders, they're refugees." The silence in the bridge was absolute. "Refugees?" Alara gasped. "From what?" Vance zoomed the image out. There, in the deep dark between the galaxies, was a shadow that was moving. A shadow that was blotting out the background radiation of the universe. "From that," Vance said. "We call it the Great Silence. It's an entropy wave, a collapse of the fundamental constants of the universe, moving inward from the void. The Scourge were trying to harvest energy to outrun it. They were running from the dark." Valdor stared at the screen, his mind reeling. The war, the politics, the borders, it all suddenly seemed so small. The galaxy was not a prize to be won, it was a lifeboat on a sinking ocean. "So," Valdor whispered, "we are all doomed?" Vance looked at the counselors, and for the first time a smile touched his lips, a grim, determined, uniquely human smile. "No," he said. "That's why we're here, that's why we built the reality anchors. We aren't going to run. We figured if the universe is breaking, we'll just have to fix it. We're going to stitch the wound shut." He looked around the bridge at his crew, then back to the aliens. "But we can't do it alone. We have the hammer, but we need the scalpel. We need your energy tech, your shields, your warp theory, combined with our durability, our anchors. We might just stand a chance." The realization dawned on the council. The humans were not just warriors, they were engineers of the impossible. They had spent their isolation not in ignorance, but in preparation for a threat the rest of the galaxy hadn't even noticed. The humans had been the sentinels in the dark, watching the storm approach, forging a shield while the Synod played at politics. Valdor looked at Vance, really looked at him, and saw not a primitive, but a brother in the face of oblivion. He extended his hand, a human gesture he had read about in the archives. "The Synod is yours to command, Admiral," Valdor said solemnly. "We will provide the energy, you provide the anchor." Vance took the hand, his grip firm and calloused. "Then let's get to work," the human said. "We have a universe to save." From that day, everything changed. The USC Dauntless was towed to the great shipyards of Xylos, not to be scrapped, but to be upgraded. Xylofian crystal matrix generators were installed alongside human fusion reactors. Vracyr armor-plating ceremonies were held in the mess halls. The humans, once the outcasts, became the architects of the new Galactic Alliance. They taught the aliens how to build things that lasted, how to find comfort in the weight of matter, how to hold the line. And the aliens taught the humans how to weave light, how to listen to the song of the stars. The great silence was coming, a tide of nothingness that threatened to unmake all things, but for the first time in cosmic history, the galaxy was not afraid. They looked to the center of the formation where the Dauntless floated, no longer just a slab of gray metal, but a glowing, shimmering monument to unity, a fusion of brute force and elegant grace. It was the anvil upon which the future would be forged. The humans had brought the warship, but in doing so they had brought something far more powerful: hope. The silence of the void would not claim them, not without a fight that would ring through the eons. The story of the human warship became a legend not of conquest, but of the day the galaxy learned that even the softest flesh, when possessed of an iron will, can stand against the end of time. In the quiet cycles that followed the battle of the Synodal Gate, the integration of humanity into the galactic fold was not seamless, nor was it without friction. It was a grinding of gears, a collision of philosophies that sparked and flared before eventually finding a rhythm. The Dauntless sat in the dry dock of Xylos Prime like a sleeping beast, its massive hull overshadowed by the delicate spires of the alien shipyards, yet commanding a gravitational presence that made the local workers uneasy. Human engineers, clad in their utilitarian jumpsuits, walked the crystalline walkways of the station, their heavy boots clanking against floors designed for the silent tread of the Xylofians. They were loud, they laughed with open mouths, they consumed rations that smelled of preserved meats and synthesized carbohydrates, offending the delicate olfactory senses of the NIM. Yet whenever a heavy girder needed lifting, or a fusion coupling needed manual realignment in a radiation zone, it was the humans who stepped forward, shrugging off the danger with a casual stoicism that baffled their new allies. To the galaxy, technology was a means to eliminate effort. To humans, technology was a tool to amplify effort. This fundamental difference became the bedrock of the new alliance. Deep within the council chambers, the political landscape was shifting tectonically. High Counselor Valdor found himself defending the humans almost daily against the more conservative factions of the Synod who viewed the Terran influence as a corruption of their pure aesthetic. "They are dirty," a representative from the crystalline Otari argued, its body vibrating with indignation. "They bolt metal onto metal. They use explosions to move pistons. They are savages with star charts." Valdor, having stood on the bridge of the Dauntless and seen the abyss of the Great Silence, could only shake his head. "They are not savages," he countered, his voice filled with a weary wisdom. "They are pragmatists. We have spent millennia perfecting the art of the sail, while they have been building the breakwater. When the tsunami comes, Counselor, do not look to the sail." It was this sentiment that slowly permeated the upper echelons of the government. The realization that their refined, frictionless society had left them soft, lacking the calluses required to grip the sword of survival. Meanwhile, Admiral Vance and his crew were not idle. The repairs to the Dauntless were extensive. The reality anchor, technically the Higgs field stabilizer array, had burned out its primary coils during the standoff with the Singularity. Rebuilding it required materials that humanity did not possess, elements that could only be synthesized in the high-energy refineries of the Concordat. This necessitated a level of cooperation that forced the species to interact. Human physicists sat down with Xylofian harmonic theorists. The humans brought equations scribbled on whiteboards, messy chaotic math that solved problems through brute force approximation. The Xylofians brought holographic symphonies of data, elegant and precise. The friction was palpable. "You cannot simply force the gravitons into alignment," a Xylofian theorist insisted, his skin flushing violet in frustration. The harmonic resonance will shatter the containment. Dr. Eris Thorne, the chief engineer of the Dauntless, rubbed his eyes, stained with grease. We're not trying to sing it to sleep, buddy. We're trying to nail it to the floor. Look, if we pulse the emitter at this frequency. He sketched a jagged line over the elegant hologram. The Zalophian recoiled, but then, looking closer, his bioluminescence pulsed. The jagged line, crude as it was, cut through the harmonic interference pattern perfectly. It was ugly, but it worked. It was the microcosm of the entire alliance, human grit providing the structure for alien grace. As the months turned into a year, reports from the deep-range probes began to trickle in. The Great Silence was accelerating. Entire star clusters on the fringe of the galaxy were simply vanishing, not exploding, not going dark, but ceasing to exist. The data streams just stopped. The Scourge, the refugees, as Vance had called them, were regrouping, but not to attack. They were fleeing in a chaotic stampede, their path taking them directly through the core systems of the Concordat. Panic began to rise again in the population. The end of days cults sprang up on a dozen worlds, but this time the Council did not freeze. They had a plan, the Aegis Protocol, a joint operation led by the newly refitted Dauntless and supported by the combined fleets of the Concordat and the Vrakyr. The plan was audacious. They would not just defend. They would deploy the reality anchor at the galactic rim, creating a firebreak in the fabric of spacetime, a wall of stabilized reality that the entropy wave could not cross. It was a geoengineering project on a cosmic scale. The day the fleet launched was a day etched into history. The Dauntless led the formation, but it was changed. Its gray armor was now laced with veins of gold and silver, Concordat energy conduits that channeled the power of a captured star into the reality anchor. Flanking it were the graceful cruisers of the Zalophians and the predatory dreadnoughts of the Vrakyr. As they engaged the warp drives, the combined energy signature was visible from the surface of planets in the sector, a new constellation born of war and unity. On the bridge, Admiral Vance stood next to War Master Krell. The Vrakyr had insisted on being on the flagship. "If we die," Krell had said, sharpening his claws, "I wish to die standing on the hardest ground in the universe." Vance had just nodded. They understood each other now. The journey to the rim was tense. As they got closer to the affected zone, the stars began to thin out. The background radiation dropped to near absolute zero. The sensation of wrongness permeated the ship. The crew reported nightmares. The aliens reported a dull, psychic screaming. It was the sound of the universe dying. When they arrived at the coordinates, the sight was beyond compare. A wall of nothingness, a horizon of absolute black was eating the stars. It looked like a cliff edge at the end of the world. The Scourge fleet was there, frantic, their ships battered and failing as the entropy wave nipped at their heels. They fired on the Allied fleet not out of malice, but out of blind panic, trying to push through. "Hold fire," Vance ordered. "Shields up, let them pass." It was a controversial order. The Scourge had slaughtered millions. But Vance knew that killing them now served no purpose. The Dauntless absorbed the frantic fire of the Scourge, its new hybrid shields flaring but holding firm. The Scourge ships streamed past, fleeing into the galaxy, leaving the Allied fleet alone with the monster. "Deploy the anchor," Vance commanded. The Dauntless began to transform. The massive railgun ports retracted, and from the belly of the ship, a spire of crystal and steel extended. The Zalophian generators spun up, humming with a sound that vibrated the bones. The human reactors roared. The energy output spiked. The anchor fired. It wasn't a beam. It was a pulse, a ripple of normality that blasted outward. Where the pulse hit the wall of nothingness, the entropy stopped. It was like watching water hit a glass wall. The nothingness roiled and boiled, trying to consume the stabilized space, but the laws of physics, reinforced by the will of the Alliance, held firm. The Dauntless shook violently. "Structural integrity at 60%, shouted a bridge officer. "The sheer forces are tearing us apart." The ship was acting as the literal nail holding the universe together. "Divert all power to the structural integrity fields," Vance yelled. "War Master, get your ships to reinforce our flank." The Vrakyr dreadnoughts moved in, extending magnetic grapples, physically latching onto the Dauntless to lend their mass and power to the effort. It was a chain of ships, a chain of species, holding hands against the dark. For 3 days they held the line. The strain was unimaginable. Metals screamed, crystals shattered, and men and aliens alike collapsed from exhaustion. But the wall held. The entropy wave, finding an immovable object, began to dissipate, its energy spent against the anchor's field. It broke like a wave on a shore, receding back into the deep void. When the sensors finally confirmed the retreat of the anomaly, silence fell over the bridge. It was broken by a single, soft sob from Sub-Minister Alara, who had joined the mission as a diplomatic observer. Then a cheer erupted. A rough, discordant, beautiful cheer of human shouts, Vrakyr roars, and Zalophian chimes. They had done the impossible. They had stared down the end of everything and said no. The return of the fleet was not a military parade. It was a religious event. The Dauntless, battered, fused with parts of Vrakyr ships, glowing with unstable energies, was hailed as the savior ship. But the true victory was in the council chambers. The Scourge, seeing the power of the Alliance, surrendered. They were granted sanctuary in the uninhabited Outer Rim under the watchful eye of the Vrakyr. The Galactic Concordat was dissolved, and in its place, the United Systems of the Aegis was born. The emblem was a shield, crossed with a Vrakyr blade and a Xylophian scroll. Humanity, once the forgotten primitives, were now the shield-bearers. They did not rule, they protected. They built the great orbital forts, the deep space habitats, the logistics networks. They became the backbone of a new golden age. Admiral Vance retired to a small colony world, a place with green grass and blue skies, far from the cold metal of the Dauntless. He sat on his porch one evening watching the sun set when High Counselor Valdor approached. Valdor had retired as well, passing the mantle to a younger generation. He sat beside Vance, the two old leaders watching the stars come out. "You know," Valdor said softly, "we always thought the Great Filter was a test of intelligence. That only the smartest civilizations survived." Vance took a sip of his drink. And we were wrong," Valdor admitted. "It is a test of stubbornness, of the will to endure. You humans, you are the most stubborn creatures in existence." Vance smiled. "I'll take that as a compliment." "It was intended as one," Valdor replied. They sat in silence for a while, two friends from different worlds, bound by the memory of the day the metal moon stood still. Above them in the night sky, a new star shone brighter than the rest. It wasn't a star, of course. It was the Dauntless, permanently stationed at the edge of the system, a silent vigil, an eternal promise that as long as humanity drew breath, the light would never go out. The galaxy was vast and dark and full of terrors, but now it had a shield, and that changed everything. The legacy of the Dauntless extended far beyond the generation of Vance and Valdor. It became the template for a new class of vessel, the Bulwark class. World ships. These were not ships of war in the traditional sense, but mobile habitats, mobile fortresses, capable of anchoring reality in unstable sectors. This technology allowed the Alliance to explore regions of space previously thought uninhabitable, the chaotic wild zones where physics was fluid. Humanity led these expeditions, their natural resilience and adaptability making them perfectly suited for the frontier. They found new civilizations, lost in the chaotic eddies of the wild zones, and brought them into the fold. The Alliance grew, not through conquest, but through rescue. The human philosophy of the pack became the dominant galactic ethos. If one of us is threatened, all of us answer. Centuries later, a monument was erected in the central plaza of Sol Prime, the new capital of the Alliance. It was not a statue of a general or a politician. It was a section of the original hull plating of the Dauntless, scorched, pitted, ugly, and beautiful. Inscribed upon it in the languages of 100 species was a simple phrase, the final transmission of the Dauntless before it engaged the silence: "Here we stand." It was a reminder to all who looked upon it that peace was not a natural state of the universe, but a garden that had to be walled against the wilderness. And the humans were the wall. The story of the primitive apes who threw rocks at the darkness until the darkness blinked became the foundational myth of a civilization that would last until the last star grew cold. And even then, one could imagine, there would be a human ship, battered and defiant, refusing to let the light die without a fight. The universe had tried to break them, and in doing so had forged them into something unbreakable. The human warship had not just changed the war, it had changed the definition of what it meant to be alive in a hostile cosmos. It meant to endure. In the end, the records of the Zalophian archives describe humanity not as conquerors, nor as saviors, but as the great anchor. The text reads, "Before the humans we were leaves in the wind, beautiful, fragile, drifting. We thought the wind was our master. The humans taught us that we could be the stone. They taught us that while the wind may blow, the stone remains. And upon that stone we built a future that defies the dark. This is the true legacy of the USC Dauntless. Not the enemies it destroyed, but the friends it allowed to survive. And somewhere in the deep black, the descendants of Vance and his crew still fly, patrolling the rim, watching the shadows, ready to light the fires and hold the line, forever the guardians of the flame."